Well, first I'd like to thank David. That was marvelous. And to thank Deborah, not only for inviting me, but for doing the entire Catalyst Conversation events. I've come to a number of them. And the Broad Institute for hosting us tonight. It's incredibly great to be here. And so as I said, I've come to a number of these talks, and I always leave really marveling at the connections that are made between the artist and the scientist. But I'm going to start off with a confession tonight, and that is, after my first meeting with David, I came home and I said to my husband, Penn, this is never going to work. We have nothing in common. And he said, well, maybe that's the interesting part. Maybe it's your differences that are the really interesting aspect of this. And of course, over this time that we've talked and met up, I have, I do think there are interesting sort of deeper correspondences. But for me, I'm still delighting in the differences with how we approach beauty. And though there is one thing I'm certain that is in common, which is a few months ago, neither of us ever expected to be standing up in front of a group of people trying to explain or answer the question, what is beauty? Because it is an enormous subject, and I too have come away with many more questions than answers. So that's where you guys come in at the end during the question and answer section of this. Because it's such a big subject, you really can't enter it through the front door. You have to sort of come around the side. And as Deborah said in her introduction, she gave us a few subtopics, and I was very excited about ambiguity because that was one I really wanted to talk about. And you'll notice I'll craftily not really talk about some of the other ones. But I'll start first when I'm talking about ambiguity with this series I've been doing of donut paintings. And the first two slides you've just seen have come from that series. And this is my studio in around 2006. And when I first started the series of paintings of donuts, what I was really jazzed about was pretty much a very textbook definition of the idea of irony, of the juxtaposition between what is being portrayed and the manner in which it's presented to you. And so I knew they had to be big paintings because I wanted that sort of tension between it's a donut and yet it's huge, it's formally painted and it's on a monumental scale. I'll just take an aside because one of the talks I came to here at the Catalyst Conversation Talks last year was Margaret Livingstone, a neuroscientist at Harvard who studies brain, vision, and art. And she talked about how when you make something a lot bigger than it normally is or a lot smaller, you in fact use a different part of your brain to process that information. So you are, in fact, seeing it differently. And I was really intrigued by that, and I still need to go talk with her more about that, but didn't have time in the preparation of this talk. But so it's that idea of seeing something differently. And I'll just take another quick aside, because there was a writer who wanted to do a piece on my work early on. And as we talked, I was starting to get more and more uncomfortable with her take, because her take, I thought, was that I was doing paintings of donuts. And my take was I was doing paintings of donuts. And it was all in that emphasis. And that emphasis was huge to me. And I was sure I was right. But later I realized, actually I wasn't right. That sort of we both were right, or maybe we both were wrong. And what I mean by that is that you want to hold both of those ideas sort of equally in your mind. And I came across, and I'm going to move over to here because I like to quote people verbatim, this great explanation of an oxymoron by Bruce Ferguson, who's a curator, where he described it as it being a space where two seemingly incompatible elements can work together, a space where choice is suspended and contrary impulses occupy the same position simultaneously. And he called it a space of undecidability. And I love that. And as I was working on this talk and reading more about the confluence of science and art and how the brain sees things, I came across a British neuroscientist named Semir Zeki, who says that ambiguity is, in fact, an extremely precise concept neurologically. And here's what he says. It is not uncertainty, but certainty, the certainty of many equally plausible interpretations, each of which is sovereign when it occupies the conscious stage. And isn't that astoundingly similar to what the curator said? I was really struck by that. But then Zeki goes on to say, the brain is most exercised and titillated when it has too much to think about, when it cannot quite decide what it is taking in. And I mean, don't you love a neuroscientist who uses the word titillated in his paper? So when I'm making these paintings, I'm thinking about scale. And here's where David and I had some interesting conversations on moving from something large back to something small and moving back again. And I was reading a lot about Rothko, but it was more the photographer Andreas Gursky who makes these enormous photographs. But Rothko said something that really touched me, and that is bigger paintings can somehow, it seems counterintuitive or reverse, can somehow seem more intimate. And it's because they embrace your entire field of vision. And I was quite curious to see, you know, could you make a painting of a donut be overwhelming, possibly even terrifying, and yet could it also be intimate at the same time? And that's where you get some more of the ambiguity going on. And here's a detail of the painting that had been on the left, the upper part. And one of the things I've been talking with my students about is this idea of flipping between at what point, at what distance are you from a painting where the paint, the stuff you make it of, the data, if you will, that you start with, flips between being paint to becoming image, and then all of a sudden it's an illusion, and it's actually a lie. I mean, am I spending my whole time making this elaborate lie? And where does truth come in? I mean, these are all questions you could start talking about with beauty. Truth, lies, resolution. And certainly, I will frankly say, I always love these holes where the jelly got put in the jelly donut. And I did a whole series of paintings of just the holes. And that pushed the idea a little bit further because they became, at the same time, both more abstract, but also more real, almost more visceral. That's probably a talk for another evening, kind of the talk you probably wouldn't want to invite your mother to because it gets really racy. So here's my studio. And here's where, unfortunately, I can't actually, I wanted to illustrate this because we talked about going from messy data up to something else. And most actually painters in the audience will be thinking, oh, that's such a neat studio. But the thing I don't have any images of, because I never take images of them, are what the donuts actually look like when they're sitting on the tables. So that, I mean, and there's crud and they're moldy, and I've had them forever. And a friend of mine came in once when I hadn't cleaned up the studio, and she said, it's just astounding what comes from the detritus that you've got here. And so I suppose at some point I should probably photograph this so I could do a talk like this next time I have to talk on beauty. Because there is an interesting question of what, is there ugliness out of which something else is made? And this is the top part of that yellow painting. And the other thing I wanted to talk about, which painters know, but a lot of people who don't paint don't think about, is that I am painting at arm's length. So I am always working with the information that is 2 feet away from me, but then trying to make it coalesce with the painting that is, you know, when I'm 20 feet away from it, so that when you walk in the room, you read it the way I want you to read it. And I'm not after a particular verisimilitude. I don't want it to look photoreal. I want it to have an emotional, you can have an emotional response to it. But you can't sort of save a little perfect passage unless it works with the bigger whole. And so I'm always going back and forth between 2 feet away, 10 feet away, 20 feet away, back to 2 feet away. And I'm working with information at very different scales, always. And it's when I stop working at different scales that I really screw up. In other words, if I spend too long standing here doing this and I start becoming the wrist painter rather than the arm painter, that's when I know I'm in trouble, just so you know. And so not long, that painting, the yellow painting was 70 by 70, so it's not that big, but about 3 years ago, the space next to my studio became available, and I got it, and I was so excited. It was a mess. It was all storage for years and years and years, but we renovated it, and I got a new white wall, new wallboard, painted it, and the first thing I did was paint these paintings, these very small paintings that are 3 inches by 4 inches. And I thought that was just me being a contrarian, because I am a contrarian. I've been accused of it, and they're absolutely right. Because I was, all of a sudden I could paint a painting that was now like 10 feet by 20 feet, but I come in and I do a 3 by 4. But I've been thinking about that since, and I'm wondering if it's actually somewhat related back to what Margaret Livingstone said, which is, now I've painted it so small, you're using a different part of your brain to understand it. But also, you come back to this idea that Rothko had, because when he talked about the big paintings embracing you, he also talked about the small paintings making you stand outside of your experience. And I begin to wonder, is there a difference there? Does something this small and this big of a space make you actually become more aware of the space? You become aware of yourself as a viewer. It could be the difference between art that you look at and art where you see yourself looking. I don't know, I may be wrong. But here's the painting at about 12 feet away. And what the other interesting thing I found about painting these is that I painted them obviously this close when I first started, but then I would put them up on the wall like that, and I would move back and forth. And I was astounded by how your how precise your vision is. How even when something is only this big and you're looking at it from 20 feet away, you can see what's wrong with it. You can know it has to be changed, and you can make this little teeny mark, and it changes everything. And here's a way in which you will never see that painting, because now it's, what, 6 feet tall by 8 feet tall, and it's 3 inches by 3 inches. And these are all painted with oil paint, the same, obviously much smaller brushes. And so the first day that David and I met, I took notes. And then later I went back and looked at them, and I just had to show this because you not only see how my mind works, a dangerous thing to show, I'm sure, to a room that probably has neuroscientists and psychotherapists in it. But anyway, you'll notice that pattern up on the upper left has no friends. It's all by itself. I wasn't at all interested in pattern, but the part that really intrigued me when we were sitting down and chatting was that rectangle in the middle. Oh, I have a pointer. The rectangle in the middle here, because that is my interpretation of David telling me what he did. And he talked about how you have human biology down here on one layer, and then you have all the messy data that is taken from that, and it's got random errors and it's got layers, but then above that sometimes there is something beautiful that you can look back down into that and come with beautiful equations or beautiful thoughts or connections. And then then I was at home that night thinking, okay, what am I going to show for this? And I came across this image of my studio from 2007. And what intrigued me about this, it may be a bit matchy-matchy, I know, excuse me, but it seemed like it was so similar. You know, there was this idea, was all these little drawings here that don't really work out. And then I started a line where they're starting to coalesce, and that, in fact, was called my sequence series. And then from that upper level is a grouping of 4 paintings that came out of those drawings, but actually also came out of even the lower drawings as well. And this is that group of 4. There's a whole other, aside from this, how this is coming out of the language of film, but that's another lecture. These also came out of the drawings that you saw on that wall. And here the questions I started thinking about is how much so I'm not giving you all the information of what's happening here, but how much is our brain filling in? I mean, those gaps, what is our brain doing with those gaps? How are they understanding what is left out? And William James once said, there is a presence in what is missing. And I love that thought. And if you notice, because this comes up in the next group of slides, there's a blue ball in that painting. And it's only been in the last week that I've made connections with that blue ball. All these have also then now led into this newer series of hands holding things. And when David said he might be talking about emotional beauty, it struck me that, how do we give objects meaning? I mean, these objects don't have meaning that is inherent in them. It's everything we project onto them. I mean, look at the magic 8-ball. Now, I personally don't use magic 8-balls because I believe everything they say. And I just couldn't possibly, because what if it says something I don't want it to say? My favorite of the sayings is, better not tell you now. I mean, who wrote those? I mean, that's great. And so, but then this globe, too, if you think about the globe, it stands in for something. I mean, talk about truth and representation. What does this represent? It represents something that is so much greater than us, so much bigger than we are. And yet here we have a representation of it where we can hold it in our hands. And that sort of, that tenderness, that doing something so tactile with something that conceptually is so enormous. Where does that fit in all of this? Then last week, here at another Catalyst, I'm like the show person for Catalyst Conversation Talk. So last week at a Catalyst Conversation Talk, Jacob Brandes, who's a theoretical physicist at Harvard, talked about the importance of spheres throughout the history of mathematics. And if you start to look for spheres, you see them also in the history of art. I mean, we were just in New York and saw one in a Bellini painting. And so is there a way in which spheres, too, are some sort of underlying mathematical structure that we might be attracted to in one way or another? Frankly, I'm a little skeptical of like putting that kind of meaning from the outside in rather than having come from the inside out, so I don't know. So we'll see where I go with that idea, but I found it quite curious that I've been painting hands holding things, and I would say the great majority of them are all spheres. And the one I most recently have been working with is the crystal ball. And that's an amazing thing as a painter to work with, because the crystal ball itself, when you try to make an image of it, it is the light passing through it. I mean, you don't actually see the crystal ball. You see what it reflects, what's behind it, what's around it. So it is both nothing and everything at the same time. And so I've been thinking about beauty for the last month, much more than I had for a very long time. And I don't know if there's any kind of through line going on here. We've talked about multiple kinds of beauty, and each one brings a bigger discussion. I mean, how does the ugliness play into it? One thing I thought was really curious is when Deborah asked me to do this talk, I thought, well, I should read up on this. I'm supposed to know this stuff, right? And I did have a number of books on beauty at home. I had, because I read in the 90s when everybody else did. But I realized that the only book on the subject that I actually kept in my studio was Umberto Eco's On Ugliness, his pairing book with the history of beauty. But the rest of my books about beauty were all at home and never looked at. And it was the On Ugliness book that I had at the studio. So, and this is my last slide, but one thing I will end with, because I keep on coming back to it, in Uncontrollable Beauty, which is a compilation of essays on the subject, which is quite wonderful, Bill Beckley says at one point, maybe beauty is generosity because it reveals itself freely. And those are my thoughts on beauty.